One thing I love to talk about on my program, drugs. The war on drugs. Specifically, now we are facing the crisis of fentanyl. Now, what if I told you, and for my regular viewers and listeners, you already know this, but what if I told you that fentanyl, the crisis of fentanyl, was made up? They made it up. It's not actually a crisis. Well, hold the phone. Hold the phone. Where and how are people dying from fentanyl? Oftentimes you see in the media fentanyl overdose deaths. Overdose? Is anyone dosing fentanyl? No, they're not. Well, maybe. Maybe it's possible. Some people, their drug of choice is fentanyl. But most people, their drug of choice is heroin, cocaine, marijuana. There have been areas in illegal states, we're talking North Carolina, South Carolina, where people have purchased marijuana, plant matter, that is somehow laced with fentanyl. How is that possible? I don't know. But why? Well, there's two reasons why dealers and manufacturers would use fentanyl. Now, again, of course, the dealers and manufacturers in the United States are not legalized. And so, therefore, their only motive is profit. In a legalized scenario, the motives would be profit and safety. But in an illegalized scenario, the only motive is profit. So dealers and manufacturers, they will add fentanyl to their products for multiple reasons. Some drugs, like methamphetamine, you can use fentanyl. Somehow it makes the drug cheaper to produce. I'm not a chemist. I don't know how or why. But somehow you see a lot of fentanyl-laced methamphetamine. You also see fentanyl-laced cocaine and heroin. You might be thinking, why would fentanyl be cut with cocaine? They're the opposite. Hey, whatever. But there's two reasons. One, because it's cheaper to substitute a drug, like cocaine. You can just make a couple percentage points of that fentanyl, which is extremely cheap. And people will buy it anyway because they're addicted. And the second reason is why would we find things like fentanyl-laced marijuana? How is that possible? Like, marijuana's a plant. You just pick the leaves off the plant and you hang them up and shit. Like, where's the fentanyl being introduced? But fentanyl is being introduced to marijuana for addictive purposes. They want you to smoke the marijuana and get addicted to the fentanyl. If it doesn't kill you, you'll be thinking, everyone else's weed sucks. I want to get the good weed from Jeff down the street. And Jeff is selling you fentanyl. That's why. Now, again, both of these things are made up. When I say that, the government could legalize these drugs and fentanyl would disappear. Just like that. It would be gone. But the United States doesn't actually want to prevent people from being murdered by fentanyl poisoning. They don't care. You see the former president of the United States going out there saying we need to execute drug dealers and drug users need to go into steel cages for tens of years. The United States makes a lot of money for themselves with the war on drugs. The war on drugs, in effect, is a gigantic money laundering scam started by racists in the United States who wanted to find a way to restrict the votes and rights of Black Americans. For those of you that don't know, the 1960s occurred A decade of which substantial political change occurred in the United States of America, including but not limited to two pieces of legislation, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 1965. Who was president during this time period? Well, you got Lyndon B. Johnson, who was president a couple years later. You might know a guy named Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, not a fan of black Americans. Needless to say, he drafted policy agendas and legislation agendas, which include the Controlled Substances Act. The primary motivating factor for the Controlled Substances Act was to restrict the votes of anti-war Vietnam protesters, which were typically associated with the white hippie movement, and black people. Because the Voting Rights Act had a loophole that said, well, your right to vote, you get sent to prison. And so what did they do? Well, they found a new way to send a bunch of black people and white hippies to prison. That's what started the war on drugs. Then they created another federal agency called the, what is it? The Drug Enforcement Agency. You know this? It's a fake agency. There's really no difference between the Drug Enforcement Agency and those like door-to-door saleswomen that are trying to sell you on like this Tupperware collection. But then you go, wait a second, maybe I can sell the Tupperware collection too. And then they, pyramid schemes. It's a money laundering scam, is what the DEA is. They provide no actual service to everyday Americans. Because if the DEA did not exist, what would that society look like? It would look like a society where we have these drugs legalized and regulated by the government in a way so that no one would die from fentanyl poisoning. No one would overdose from drugs because they didn't know what's in it. They would go to the drugstore. Maybe you can make it as part of a regulation for them to take a test or some shit. Hey, that's a fair conversation. I'm down to have that conversation. But they could go and get their drug of choice. And if they needed help, if they could want to get help, it should be free. And then fentanyl poisoning would no longer be a thing. Hundreds of thousands of people over the last few years that have died unnecessarily have died for no reason. But wait a second. What am I getting at? Why the fuck am I talking about this fucking shit? I thought this is a goddamn news show. Well, I saw some garbage in my newsfeed. Again, the war on drugs is a money laundering scam. It is a scam. But what do they gain out of it besides paying a bunch of meathead freaks a salary to go beat the shit out of minorities and steal their property? I'm talking about the DEA. Like, where's the money being laundered? Where's the power being laundered? Well, here we have an example of something that I found just to be bizarre. Bizarre. U.S. and Mexico weighing deal for Mexico to crack down on fentanyl going north, while the U.S. cracks down on guns going south. What is this? Again, it's a money laundering scam, and it's a power laundering scam. Who do you think are going to be the United States agencies that are in charge of cracking down on guns? They're going to hire more meathead cops to steal money from the government coffers to do basically nothing to combat a problem that could be solved without talking to Mexico. Now, again, I have no issue with opening communications with Mexico. That's a good thing, generally speaking. But the fentanyl crisis is made up. It was created by Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon laid the groundwork for the fentanyl crisis. But it wasn't just Richard Nixon. It was Bill Clinton. When Bill Clinton signed in a piece of legislation colloquially known as the Crime Bill, of the 1990s, of course, authored by current President Joseph Robinette Biden. This crime bill, of course, further penalized and punished people who used drugs. Again, specifically targeting Black Americans. The hippie movement, by this point, was completely destroyed, wiped out. There's no more hippies after the Reagan years. But there's still black people. And Bill Clinton thought, hey, we got to find a way to control black people some way. So let's beef up the crime bills. But again, it's a manufactured crisis. It's all made up. It's all garbage. But let's read some interesting details here. The U.S. is preparing to announce a deal with Mexico to counter fentanyl coming across the southern border, with Mexico cracking down on labs and smuggling, while the U.S. does more to stop the flow of U.S. guns into Mexico. Two sources familiar with the strategy told NBC News Mexican military and police, with the help of U.S. law enforcement, will focus on tracking raw materials for fentanyl being shipped to Mexico, finding and shutting down labs that make the deadly synthetic opioid that's going after key players in the illicit fentanyl trade. How do you think they're going to do all of this? More money. That's what all of this is for. To give police agencies in Mexico and in the United States more money. That's all it is. Now, another interesting fact about fentanyl that you may not know is fentanyl is so potent at such small doses, and it's so easy to hide, and it's so easy to transport, that you can actually send fentanyl through the global mailing system. A lot of countries, including China, have very lax regulations on fentanyl production. A lot of people are able to snatch some fentanyl off of the lines, package it up in a play toy from a sweatshop, send it on over to the United States, and boom, fentanyl smuggling. So Mexico is not the only source of fentanyl. But of course, that's part of the conspiracy for them to get a bunch more money and deal with Mexico, as they want to pretend that Mexico is the main source of fentanyl in this country. Of course, fentanyl is being produced all across the planet. It's easily shippable. And unless we pay thousands and thousands and thousands of guys globally to check every piece of mail thoroughly, which, by the way, I do not endorse, the onslaught of fentanyl poisoning in the United States is going to continue. And so again, if the United States' ostensible goal is to stop fentanyl poisoning in the United States, what does this do to further that goal? Nothing. It does nothing. The rates of fentanyl poisoning will remain the same. Law enforcement agencies that work in these instances will get their bonuses. A lot of people are going to get a nice, fat, and juicy promotion. And a bunch of people are going to get hired on, hey, maybe I can get my brother down here. Hey, I can get my friend from the bar down here. Give him a free job at the DEA. And we can just fucking kill a bunch of fucking immigrants and beat the shit out of black people for no reason, just because they might have drugs, and collect some fat paychecks while we go and spend all of our stolen cash on a bunch of, like, you know, you ever see the shit that they have at, like, these fucking goddamn criminal institutions? I'm talking about police organizations. You know, you got the fanciest coffee maker. You got, like, a fucking super toilet that costs $4,000. You got all this crazy shit in the break room that they use their stolen money to buy. Right, so that's a whole thing. Obviously, I don't support or endorse law enforcement in any fashion. I believe to abolish law enforcement, especially the DEA. The DEA needs to be abolished. I would go further to say that everyone who works in the DEA should go to jail. That's my opinion. If you worked in the DEA, you're no better than the Gestapo, and you belong in prison. So that's my opinion. Maybe a little radical. Some people might not like that, but that's just my opinion. But that has nothing to do with the fact of the matter that the DEA is a fake organization. It is a criminal empire. And all of this is a bunch of window dressing for them to pretend like they're solving a problem that they're not actually going anywhere close to solving, Joe Biden's going to pretend like he's going against the fentanyl poisoning crisis when he's not going to do anything to actually create a dent. When are we even going to have any information, right, about the fentanyl poisoning rates? It might be a year, 2 years before we have data that would even be able to suggest that this move could theoretically have reduced the amount of fentanyl poisonings in the country. And by that point, no one will remember this except for the people in the DEA, Border Patrol, and other law enforcement agencies that are going to get fat sums of cash from the United States and Mexican governments, while the people in these countries continue to suffer and die for little to no reason. So anyway, there you go. That's my segment.